This is Blighted Pine Books, and today we're going to be taking a look at the novel The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. This was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and a obviously New York Times bestseller here. So this is the debut novel of Vietnamese-American author Viet Thanh Nguyen. He won the Pulitzer Prize for this book in 2016. And I was attracted to it simply because a colleague had recommended it to me, and I have been searching for more like modern literary fiction, something that's along the lines of like maybe a classic in the making. So this book, it explores, interestingly, the themes of primarily like duality, identity, and ideological pathology, the way in which many people we gravitate towards like specific worldviews and latch on to those worldviews. And I think like today in 2024, especially with the election coming up, a book like this is all more prescient, and it really challenges some of those like more like some of our more binary thinking. And I think it attempts to like kind of explode our binary thinking about the world. And that's what I thought this novel was like primarily really good at. So basically, this novel is about a North Vietnamese spy who escapes the fall of Saigon, and he communicates throughout the course of the novel with a couple of his communist revolutionaries, one being like his blood brother, Man, back in Vietnam, and also his French aunt, who's also like a communist revolutionary. And I think most importantly, this novel, it's a satire on the Americanization of the Vietnam War, a satire on the Americanization of other cultures and countries in general. And like the whole book, it's like this battle of voices internationally, with the United States, of course, being like the primary hegemon in that arena. Yeah, essentially, it takes on, I think, very directly the film Apocalypse Now. And it's like a satire of Francis Ford Coppola's worldview regarding the primacy of Western ideology in the Western worldview. All right, so just like a brief summary of the book without too many spoilers, because it is a fairly plot-driven book. So again, as I mentioned, it takes place, it opens actually in the fall of Saigon in 1975, so it's like the end of the Vietnam War, in which the unnamed narrator is escaping with a band of South Vietnamese military officials and one of his two blood brothers. In this case, his name is Bon. And then in this chaotic, harrowing scene, it's one of the more violent scenes in literature. Bon looks at his son and his wife as they are murdered on the tarmacs, and they escape into a secondary airplane. And it's like the violent imagery in this book. This is without a doubt like these pages look quite dry, but they're quite dripping with blood. And I think I'll talk about a couple of those scenes that were like most painfully memorable in the book. But the South Vietnamese military group, they end up in California, Los Angeles, and that's where a majority of this book takes place. I'd say the book is primarily divided into thirds. First in the United States, second in the Philippines, and then third back in Vietnam. So the main character, he moves to the United States, where he moves into like the seedy apartment with his friend Bon. They spend a lot of time like drinking together, and he receives an American education, and there's like tons of various literary references in here, and you can really tell that like the author himself is like extraordinarily well versed in the Western canon. And one of the most prominent features of the main character is that he constantly refers to himself as a bastard, and he's literally a bastard in that he didn't know his father. His father was a French priest. His mother was a Vietnamese woman, and so to him, his heritage was shameful, and it's something that comes up again and again, and it makes him like ill fit in the world, and it like sets up his consciousness for never really feeling like it can like fit in any one group, whether that be in the United States or Vietnam or with the communists or the South Vietnamese, or really anybody. And by the end of the novel, he ends up calling himself the man with two minds. And so it's like this theme of like being a bastard in the world that really runs through this entire text and like connects to that theme of like ideological pathology, binary thinking, et cetera, et cetera. After he arrives in the United States, he begins to take on like some responsibilities, and the novel kind of plods along, and weirdly it reads more like a very carefully written, detailed memoir. At one point, though, his major gets wise to the fact that there's like a mole in their presence, and so the protagonist is charged with discovering who the mole is. Obviously, ironically, it's him, and he is then forced to murder this rather pathetic individual. And it's here where like the plot kind of picks up a little bit, and one of like the more interesting motifs in this book, which is like ghosts, play a role in that this individual that he murders with a pistol to the back of his head, he becomes a ghost that follows him throughout the course of the novel. And so any person that our protagonist spy murders will then become like a kind of secondary character that will like linger on the wall or on the ceiling as he's trying to fall asleep, and sometimes will play even like a comical role. So it's kind of interesting. And then the novel shifts into its like second or middle section as the narrator becomes like he's like a cultural advisor on the set of this film, The Hamlet, and he meets this guy, this auteur who is this very American dude who thinks that he's going to create the greatest masterpiece about the Vietnam War. And just like Apocalypse Now, the film that purports to like be Vietnam is actually shot in the Philippines, and it requires even extensive coercion on the part of the narrator to convince the director to even include Vietnamese dialogue. The director just can't understand why Vietnamese dialogue would be necessary in a film about the Vietnam War. And then humorously, I remember there's this one scene where our narrator tells him that like the way the play is written, that's not how a Vietnamese person even screams. And so the auteur asks him, he's like, well, then how does a Vietnamese person scream? And the narrator like pounds his fists on his desk and lets out like a guttural howl, a very, very Vietnamese guttural howl. And that's the moment when he is hired to take on this job as like the cultural advisor for this film. And that's where like the satire is really found, is in this section where the protagonist travels to the Philippines to shoot this film, The Hamlet, and they spend a few hundred pages in the Philippines, and it's mostly like disparaging the auteur, and I think this really captures the satire best, as like the auteur lacks knowledge about the culture that he's representing, and he's like obsessed with this vision that he has of the war, and acknowledges that the film itself is even going to become the war. I'll read just like a little piece about that. The longer I worked on the movie, the more I was convinced that I was not only a technical consultant on an artistic project, but an infiltrator into a work of propaganda. A man such as the auteur would have denied it, seeing his movie purely as art, but who was fooling whom? Movies were America's way of softening up the rest of the world. Hollywood relentlessly assaulting the mental defenses of audiences with the hit, the smash, the spectacle, the blockbuster, and yes, even the box office bomb. It mattered not what story these audiences watched. The point was that it was the American story they watched and loved up until the day that they themselves might be bombed by the planes they had seen in American movies. Mann, not surprisingly, understood Hollywood's function as the launcher of intercontinental ballistic missile of Americanization. I had written him a worried letter about the relevance of my work on the movie, and he had written back his most detailed messages ever. First, he addressed my concerns about the refugees. Conditions here exaggerated there. Remember our party's principles. Enemies of the party must be rooted out. His second message concerned my fear of being a collaborator with the auteur. Remember Mao at Yan'an. That was all, but it dispelled the black crow of doubt sitting on my shoulder. When was the last time an American president found it worth his while to write a speech on the importance of art and literature? I cannot recall. And so this is where like the main character, our unnamed spy, begins to realize just like the importance of art and like how he's actually participating in a piece of propaganda and how art isn't necessarily separate from politics. And so he ends up agreeing with Mao, or Chairman Mao, that that art and politics are really on a very similar mission to that, and that is like to disseminate a particular worldview. So I don't really want to spoil the rest of the book because I just think that like the final third of this novel is such an incredibly grueling surprise that I really wouldn't want to spoil it for anybody. But I will say that like the middle section of this novel, it's quite long. It seems like at some points like there's not a lot happening. There's a little bit of like unfulfilled romance going on, and you're left kind of wondering the direction that the novel is going. But then in the final third, like it really picks up its pace, and I found myself just in a couple days reading like the last 150 pages because the novel picks up such speed. So if you do decide to read this novel, know that the last third is pretty fantastic and very fast paced. So just a couple of themes that I noticed while I was reading this book. The first was voices. I think I really spent a lot of time because this book is like it's very dense. The writing is dense, and it's filled with ideas, and the writing is also really beautiful itself. But it's a really complex book, and so I spent some time just thinking like, okay, what is Viet Thanh Nguyen like really trying to get across? And in my opinion, it was the theme of voices that was most prominent to me. And so, like, while I've seen this book advertised as the Vietnam War from the perspective of a Vietnamese author, this book actually isn't about the war at all. It takes place at the very end of the war in 1975 for the fall of Saigon. And nearly all of the action, except for the final third, takes place outside of Vietnam in Los Angeles and the Philippines. So it's really, if you're looking for like a Vietnamese perspective on the Vietnam War, this is definitely it's interesting fodder for sure, but it's certainly not the case. While the novel wasn't written about the war directly, it is about the myriad of voices that battle over the narrative of the Vietnam War in hindsight. So the unnamed narrator then is like a bastard or a man with two minds, as he refers to himself. He kind of functions as a point of tension between all of these battling narratives, and he doesn't really strongly associate with any of them, and he finds like deep and problematic flaws with all of the worldviews, whether it be like North Vietnamese communism or American capitalism. Like they're all just part of the stew of voices that are trying to convince us that their perspective is the correct perspective. So the narrator even though he's a communist, he's unable to like fully embrace communism. And so as the final act of this novel makes painfully clear, the South Vietnamese or American democracy, none of them are really terribly attractive to the narrator. He loves his country, but he's haunted and tortured by his nation as well. He studies the Western canon, and he references it throughout all of the novel, but he acknowledges at the same time that its legacy of colonialism is like ultimately pretty destructive. And even when the U.S. accepts displaced migrants with open arms, it's often because it made the migrants' home country intolerable to live in the first place. So the auteur, as previously mentioned, is probably like the prime example of this particular theme. He's like the American who believes that his work of art is more important than the war itself, and that the millions that actually died were like really mere fodder for his cinematic masterpiece. And Francis Ford Coppola, I ended up seeing a clip of him saying that my film is not a movie. My film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. It's what it was really like. So you could read this novel essentially as a response to that singular statement by Francis Ford Coppola and the kind of narcissism that's embedded in a statement like that. So like any great work of literature, this book acknowledges that like really the story is very complex, politically, socially, personally, etc. The other thing I noticed was music. I thought the music in this book was just so interesting. And there's a lot of Western music. And there's one scene when the narrator is recalling a time when he was torturing a fellow Vietnamese man. This is a little excerpt from the book. After a little research, I procured a record from the jukebox of one of the Saigon bars popular with the white soldiers. Hey Good Lookin' was by the famous Hank Williams, the country music icon whose nasal voice personified the utter whiteness of the music, at least to our ears. Even someone as exposed to American culture as I shivered a little on hearing this record, somewhat scratchy from having been played so many times. Country music was the most regarded kind of music in America, where even whites played jazz and even blacks sang in the opera. Something like country music was what lynch mobs must have enjoyed while stringing up their black victims. Country music was not necessarily lynching music, but no other music could be imagined as lynching's accompaniment. Beethoven's Ninth was the opus for Nazis, concentration camp commanders, and possibly President Truman as he contemplated atomizing Hiroshima. Classical music, the refined score for the high-minded extermination of brutish hordes. Country music was set to the more humble beat of the red-blooded, bloodthirsty American heartland. So it's like reflections like that I find like really interesting, that he like considers like okay, what's the soundtrack to some of the most horrific events of the 20th century, and that Hank Williams' Hey Good Lookin' is the perfect soundtrack to America's legacy of racist lynchings in the South. And then so he's torturing this Vietnamese individual, and the song that the narrator and Bond choose to torture a prisoner with is a song that relates with the American lynch mobs. When he returns to visit this prisoner, the prisoner always says to him, "Hey, good looking." But then soon after the protagonist is unable to get a confession from this prisoner, he threatens to publish like a false confession about this prisoner, that he's actually a homosexual and that he abandoned the Liberation Front just to be with his lover. But then the next day, when the narrator returns and this song is still playing on a loop, in the prison cell, Hey Good Lookin', they find this prisoner, quote, purple, and his eyes bulged deep in his mouth, and at the back of his throat, a white lump. What the watchman had done to himself was choke him to death. He had actually taken an egg that was given to him for breakfast for good behavior and killed himself with it, all while Hank Williams' song, Hey Good Lookin', is playing in the background. And it's this kind of black humor that earns it its Pulitzer Prize sticker on the front cover. The other big theme in this book that kept coming up like again and again was this theme of shame, sexuality, and original sin. And it goes all the way back to like, there's one really like funny and disturbing scene where the narrator as a young boy, he uses a squid that his parents were going to be cooking for dinner to pleasure himself, and then he feels absolutely horrible about it, and then he cleans it. He kind of marks it so he knows which one is which, because his mother would have counted these squid, and then they eat it later for dinner. And so there's this weird thing about like sexuality and shame and original sin in this book, and there's like another really like memorable passage about that as well. And in this passage, the narrator discusses how the West invented the concept of cleavage. Okay. He says, the Chinese might have well invented gunpowder in the noodle, but the West had invented cleavage with profound, if underappreciated, implications. A man gazing on the semi-exposed breast was not only engaging in simple lasciviousness, he was also meditating, even if unawares, on the visual embodiment on the verb to cleave, which meant both to cut apart and to put together. A woman's cleavage perfectly illustrated this double and contradictory meaning. the breasts two separate entities with one identity. The double meaning was always present in how cleavage separated a woman from a man and yet drew him to her with the irresistible force of sliding down a slippery slope. Men had no equivalent, except perhaps for the only kind of male cleavage most women truly cared for, the opening and closing of a well-stuffed billfold. But whereas women could look at us as much as they wanted and we would appreciate it, we were damned if we looked and hardly less damned if we didn't. A woman with extraordinary cleavage would reasonably be insulted by a man whose eyes could resist the plunge. So just to be polite, I cast a tasteful glance while reaching for another cigarette. In between those marvelous breasts bumped a gold crucifix on a gold chain, and for once I wished I were a true Christian so I could be nailed to that cross. Okay, so again, the narrator, I think it's interesting, like the narrator isn't a good guy. Like a lot of people read this book as like, this is the Vietnamese voice. This is the voice of all Vietnamese. No. This narrator is deeply flawed. As you can tell, he's a little bit like, simple-minded when it comes to like the binary between the sexes, and like he's also pretty lascivious himself. But I do think it's really interesting that at the end he brings in the image of Christ on the cross, and that's what happens like anytime sexuality is brought up in this book. And so I think there's something in this book too about just like human nature and base human nature, and about how like no matter the ideologies that we try to create at our base, we can't really escape, like what would Hawthorne say, like the dark human heart. Like until we get at that central problem, we're never really going to solve anything. And this character, this main protagonist, he's offering no solutions in that regard. Well, maybe until the final scene, but you'll have to read that. Okay, so final thoughts on the Sympathizer. I think it's a very rich book. It's a dark novel about like the absurdity of binary thinking and the battle for control over a narrative. It's a novel that explores the immigrant experience, but from, like I mentioned, like this very warts and all perspective that makes reading something like Amy Tan a little laughably simple. The narrator, again, he's like a really deeply flawed person. But this isn't a tragedy. It's not about the downfall of this narrator by any means. In fact, rather it's a satire that ends in laughter. And at the end of the day, it's not about like or dislike, but rather it's about understanding. It offers no real lesson for the reader or anything like that, other than for us to question some of the narratives that we are fed on a regular basis, and to be more willing to add multiple voices into a space rather than enforcing a singular perspective. I also thought that it was interesting that this whole thing, I don't want to give away too much, but it's framed as a confession. And I also thought that like just that framing was really effective. And it lays bare like all the heinous acts of this bastard. But he's also this very likable guy. He's a very philosophical guy. He's curious. And he's a lovingly contemptible bastard. So all in all, I really think it's a must read. I really do. For anyone who's super into literary fiction or even historical fiction, this is a must read. Is it the classic that I thought maybe it would be? I don't know. Time will tell, but I definitely think it's worth investigating. All right, so this has been Blighted Pine Books. If you would like, I wouldn't mind if you liked and subscribed below. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this little reflection, this little review, and I hope you all have a really good rest of your day.